They all saw her fall, but only one man moved, and what he found would follow him long after that moment ended. Naomi Carter's fingers trembled as she placed the last can of discounted soup onto the conveyor belt, her breath shallow, her vision narrowing under the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly above aisle 7. The grocery store smelled of overripe fruit and floor cleaner, a strange mix that clung to the air, but Naomi barely noticed anymore. She had learned to ignore discomfort, to move through it, to keep going no matter how heavy her limbs felt. Her cart held only essentials: generic cereal, a half-gallon of milk, a loaf of bread marked down with a bright orange sticker, but even those felt like a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford. Behind her, a line of impatient customers shifted, their carts full, their eyes flicking toward her with quiet irritation. She lowered her gaze, as she always did, her dark curls pulled back into a simple bun, her worn sneakers planted firmly on the scuffed tile floor. Invisibility had always been her safest place. Across the store, Adrian Volkov stood apart from the chaos, his tailored charcoal coat falling perfectly against his frame, his presence commanding without a single word spoken. He wasn't supposed to be there. Men like him didn't wait in grocery lines or skin price tags. But something had drawn him in that afternoon, something he couldn't quite name, and now his sharp eyes moved across the room with quiet precision, noticing things others overlooked. He noticed the way Naomi's shoulders sagged under a weight no one else could see. He noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she reached into her pocket for crumpled bills. And then he noticed the moment her body gave out. It wasn't dramatic. There was no scream, no warning. Just a soft, almost silent collapse as the world tilted beneath her feet. The can slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull metallic clatter that echoed louder than it should have. Naomi's knees buckled, her body folding as if gravity had suddenly doubled its pull. Around her, people hesitated. A man in a business suit stepped back. A woman tightened her grip on her purse. No one moved. No one wanted to get involved. But Adrian did. He crossed the distance in seconds, his hand catching Naomi just before she hit the ground, steadying her weight against him with controlled strength. Up close, he could see what the others had ignored: the pale tone beneath her dark skin, the dryness of her lips, the faint hollowness in her cheeks. This wasn't an act. This was exhaustion pushed too far. As he lowered her gently, something tore at the thin plastic bag hanging from her wrist. It split open with a quiet rip, spilling its contents across the floor. A carton of milk rolled to the side. A loaf of bread slid free. And then, something else. Papers. Folded, worn, carefully kept. Adrian's gaze dropped, his expression unreadable as he caught a glimpse of the top page. Numbers. Medical codes. A name that didn't match hers. The noise of the store seemed to fade, replaced by a silence that pressed in from all sides. Naomi stirred slightly in his arms, her breath uneven, unaware that the thing she had tried so hard to hide was now in plain sight. And in that moment, as Adrian Volkov looked down at what she had been carrying, something shifted, not in the room, not in the crowd, but in him. And he didn't look away. The store did not return to normal right away, but instead lingered in a strange, uncomfortable stillness, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to decide what should happen next, and no one wanted that responsibility. A cashier cleared her throat quietly, her fingers hovering over the register keys, unsure whether to continue scanning items or pretend nothing had happened. A man near the front of the line shifted his weight and muttered something under his breath about delays, but his voice lacked conviction, fading quickly when Adrian Volkov did not move. He remained kneeling beside Naomi, one hand steady at her shoulder, the other resting lightly against her wrist, feeling the faint, uneven rhythm of her pulse. It was there, but weak, like a signal struggling to reach the surface. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge their discomfort. His attention stayed fixed on her and on the scattered items at his feet. The papers lay partially unfolded now, edges worn from being handled too many times, corners softened by careful folding and refolding. Without urgency, but with deliberate precision, Adrian reached down and lifted the top sheet, his eyes scanning quickly, absorbing details in seconds. Billing statements, medical terminology, dates that stretched back months. And at the center of it all, a name printed in bold letters that did not match the one on the grocery receipt still clutched loosely in Naomi's hand. He did not react outwardly, but something in his gaze sharpened, a quiet calculation forming beneath the surface. Around him, whispers began to build again, softer this time, more cautious. Someone suggested calling emergency services. Another voice questioned whether she had taken something or skipped meals. The assumptions came easily to them, shaped by distance and convenience. Adrian ignored all of it. Instead, he glanced toward the nearest employee, his voice low but carrying enough authority to cut cleanly through the noise. "Get the manager and bring water." Now, there was no hesitation after that. The employee nodded quickly and hurried away, as if the command itself had removed any doubt about what needed to be done. Adrian returned his attention to Naomi just as she stirred again, her brow tightening slightly, her lips parting as she tried to pull in a deeper breath. Her eyes fluttered but did not fully open, her body still caught somewhere between awareness and exhaustion. The hand that held the crumpled bills twitched weakly, as if she were trying to gather everything back before anyone could see. Adrian noticed the instinct immediately. Even like this, she was protecting something. He gently loosened her grip, not forcefully, just enough to keep the money from slipping away, then placed it beside the scattered groceries, organizing them without thought, restoring order in a way that felt almost automatic. The torn bag lay useless nearby, its contents exposed in a way that made privacy impossible. The carton of milk had rolled to a stop near his shoe, and the loaf of bread rested against the base of the checkout counter, slightly crushed but intact. Simple things, necessary things, and yet paired with documents that told a far heavier story. The manager arrived moments later, breath slightly rushed, a bottle of water already in hand. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice careful, measured, as if he understood that this situation required more than routine procedure. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he took the bottle, opened it, and dipped his fingers lightly, brushing a small amount of water against Naomi's wrist, then her temple, grounding her back toward consciousness. Her eyes opened this time, slowly, confusion clouding them before awareness rushed in all at once. The first thing she saw was not the ceiling lights or the worried faces around her. It was Adrian. And the moment she realized where she was, her expression changed completely. Not relief, not gratitude, fear, real, immediate fear. Her gaze darted downward, searching for the papers, for the things she had tried so carefully to keep hidden, and when she saw them in his hand, her breath caught sharply, her body tensing despite its weakness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand reaching toward him with a desperation that did not match the situation anyone else believed they were witnessing. "Do not look at that." But he already had. The words barely left Naomi's lips before she tried to push herself upright, her hands trembling as they reached for the papers. But her strength failed her halfway, and she swayed instead, caught again by the same steady presence that had stopped her fall moments earlier. Adrian did not pull away. He did not hand the papers back immediately either. He simply held them, his eyes still, focused, as if the weight of those thin sheets mattered more than the chaos unfolding around them. Naomi's breathing grew uneven, her gaze fixed on his hands, not his face, as if the truth written there was far more dangerous than the man holding it. "Please," she said again, a little stronger this time, though her voice still carried the fragile edge of exhaustion. "That is not mine." The lie came quickly, instinctively, but it did not land. Adrian's expression did not change. He had spent too many years reading people who hid things far more dangerous than paperwork, and this was not deception born from guilt. This was protection. He lowered the papers slightly, not out of compliance, but to meet her eyes directly, forcing her to look at him. "Then whose name is it?" "Naomi Carter." He said her name with quiet certainty, pulling it from the receipt she had dropped, and the effect was immediate. Her shoulders tensed. The room seemed to close in around her. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze flickering between his face and the documents, calculating, searching for a way out that did not exist. The manager shifted awkwardly nearby, unsure whether to intervene, while a few customers pretended to resume their shopping, though their attention remained fixed on the scene. Adrian did not acknowledge any of them. He was not asking loudly. He was not threatening. But there was no room to avoid the question. Naomi swallowed, her throat dry, her hands curling weakly into the fabric of her worn jacket. It is, she started, then stopped, the words catching before they could fully form. Her eyes dropped again, not to the floor this time, but to the name printed clearly on the page she could no longer deny seeing. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Adrian waited. That was what made it worse. He was not rushing her. He was not accusing her. He was simply waiting for the truth, and somehow that demanded more honesty than pressure ever could. It is my sister's son, she said finally, the words quiet but steady once they began. He is 6 years old. The admission seemed to take something out of her, as if holding it in had required more strength than she had left. Adrian's gaze flickered back to the paper, confirming the age, the diagnosis codes he had only briefly registered before now sharpening into meaning. Hospital visits, ongoing treatment, costs that climbed far beyond what the items in her grocery cart could ever suggest she could afford. You are paying for this, he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion drawn from the evidence in front of him. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes did not meet his this time. She did not need them to. It is not enough, she added after a moment, her voice softening further, stripped of the last pieces of resistance. It is never enough. The manager shifted again, this time stepping slightly closer with uncertainty, but Adrian lifted a hand without looking, a simple gesture that stopped him in place. The space around them seemed to narrow, isolating the two of them from everything else. Why hide it? Adrian asked, his tone unchanged, but something deeper moving beneath the surface now, something less analytical and more human. Naomi let out a slow breath, one that trembled at the edges. Because people see this and they think I am asking for something, she said, her fingers tightening slightly against her jacket. They think I am going to beg, or lie, or take advantage. Her gaze lifted then, meeting his fully for the first time, not with fear now, but with a quiet, worn honesty. I am not. The words settled between them, simple and unadorned. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Not just the exhaustion, not just the circumstances, but the consistency in everything she had said, everything she had tried to hide, everything she had chosen not to ask for even now. Around them, the store slowly began to move again, carts rolling, scanners beeping, conversations resuming in low murmurs, but the moment between them remained unchanged. And for the first time since he had stepped into that store, Adrian Volkov was not just observing a situation. He was beginning to understand it. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any quick reassurance ever could, stretching just long enough for Naomi to begin pulling herself back together, her hands moving with quiet urgency as she reached for the scattered items, gathering the bread, the milk, the small pieces of her life that had spilled into public view. She avoided the papers at first, as if touching them again might make everything worse, but eventually she had no choice, her fingers brushing against the edges as she carefully stacked them, aligning each sheet with deliberate care. It was not just organization. It was control, the kind of control she needed to maintain in a world that gave her very little of it. Adrian watched every movement, not intrusively, but attentively, noting the precision, the way she handled even the smallest detail as if it mattered. Most people in her position would have rushed, embarrassed, desperate to disappear. Naomi did not rush. She reclaimed. That difference did not go unnoticed. The manager cleared his throat softly, shifting his weight again, his voice tentative as he spoke. We can call someone if she needs help getting home. The offer was polite, but distant, the kind that existed more to resolve a situation than to understand it. Adrian finally stood, his full height commanding without effort, and the subtle shift in posture around him was immediate. The manager straightened. The nearby customers turned away more decisively, pretending interest in shelves they had already examined. Adrian handed the papers back to Naomi, not carelessly, but with intention, placing them directly into her hands rather than setting them aside. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking them, her fingers brushing against his briefly, and in that contact there was something unspoken, something neither of them acknowledged but both registered. You dropped these, he said, his voice even, as if the moment carried no deeper meaning than the words themselves. Naomi nodded, her gaze lowered again, but her grip on the papers tightened slightly, as if reassured that they were once again hers to protect. Thank you, she murmured, the words automatic but sincere. She began to rise then, slower this time, steadying herself against the counter, her movements careful, measured, unwilling to risk another collapse in front of so many watching eyes. Adrian did not assist her again. He stepped back instead, giving her space, allowing her to stand on her own, to reclaim that small piece of dignity without interference. When she was upright, she adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair, and took a breath that was deeper than the ones before, though still not quite steady. "I am fine now," she said, more to the room than to him, her voice carrying a quiet determination that did not match the physical state she was in. The manager nodded quickly, relieved at the resolution, already beginning to step away, eager to return to normal operations. But Adrian did not move. His gaze remained on Naomi, not questioning, not pressing, but present in a way that made it impossible to fully ignore him. "You have not eaten today," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation drawn from everything he had seen. Naomi stiffened slightly, the truth of it landing harder than she expected. "That is not something you need to worry about," she replied, her tone polite but guarded, a barrier rising again where honesty had briefly broken through. Adrian inclined his head slightly, accepting the boundary without challenging it directly, but not retreating from the conversation either. He reached into his coat, retrieving his wallet with the same calm precision he applied to everything else, and without asking, without announcing, he placed a card on the counter beside her groceries. The cashier, who had been watching from a careful distance, froze for a moment before understanding, her eyes widening slightly as she processed the unspoken instruction. "Everything here," Adrian said quietly, his voice low but unmistakable. Naomi's head lifted sharply at that, her eyes moving from the card to his face, confusion and resistance mixing in equal measure. "No," she began, the word immediate, instinctive, but Adrian did not look at her. He did not argue. He simply stood there, his attention already shifting toward the exit as if the decision had been made long before she had the chance to object. The cashier hesitated only briefly before beginning to scan the items, her movements careful now, respectful in a way they had not been moments earlier. Naomi stood frozen, the papers clutched tightly in one hand, her other hand hovering near the counter as if unsure whether to push the card back or let the moment pass. Around her, the store resumed its rhythm, but something had changed. Not in the lights or the sounds or the movement of carts, but in the space she occupied within it. And as Adrian turned slightly, preparing to leave, he paused just long enough to glance back at her, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a weight that settled deeply. "You are not invisible, Naomi Carter." Then he walked away, leaving behind more than just a paid receipt. Naomi did not move right away after he left, and that was what unsettled her the most. Not the attention, not the whispers that had slowly faded back into background noise, but the absence he left behind, as if something had shifted in the space around her and refused to return to what it had been before. The cashier finished scanning the last item with unusual care, placing each one into a fresh bag, slower than necessary, as though she understood that this moment required something gentler than routine. The receipt printed with a soft mechanical hum, longer than Naomi expected, the total far beyond what she had been counting in her head just minutes earlier. She stared at it without reaching, her mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened with the life she knew. A life where nothing came without cost, and certainly not without explanation. "You are all set," the cashier said quietly, her tone different now, stripped of impatience, replaced with something closer to respect. Naomi nodded, but the motion felt distant, automatic. She gathered the bags carefully, adjusting the weight so it would not strain her still unsteady arms, and tucked the folded papers securely between them, pressing them close against her side, as if proximity alone could keep them safe. For a moment, she considered leaving immediately, slipping out before anyone could say anything else, before the moment could expand into something she could not control. But her feet did not move. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the glass doors at the front of the store, where the late afternoon light filtered in, soft and golden against the polished floor. He was still there, not inside, not waiting in a way that demanded attention, but standing just beyond the doors, one hand resting lightly against the frame of a black car that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He was not looking at his phone. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply there, as if the moment inside had not yet finished for him either. Naomi's breath caught slightly, not from fear this time, but from something she could not name, something unfamiliar and unsettling in a different way. People like him did not wait. They did not linger. They acted and moved on. That was what made sense. That was what the world had taught her. And yet he had not left. She shifted the bags in her hands, the weight grounding her back into reality, reminding her of where she needed to be, of what mattered beyond this moment. The bills, the child, the time she could not afford to lose. Slowly, she began to walk, each step measured, her body still recovering, but her mind already pushing forward. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss as she approached, the cool air from inside meeting the warmth outside in a brief, quiet exchange. As she stepped through, the sunlight hit her face, forcing her eyes to narrow slightly. And for a second, she almost kept walking, almost chose the familiar path of disappearing, of letting the moment end without acknowledgement. But she stopped. It was not a dramatic halt, not something anyone else would have noticed, but it was enough. Adrian turned his head slightly, as if he had been aware of her approach without needing to see it, his gaze settling on her with the same calm focus as before. There was no urgency in him, no expectation, just presence. Naomi hesitated, her grip tightening on the bags, the papers pressing against her side. "You did not have to do that," she said finally, her voice steady but softer than before, the words carrying more weight now that they were no longer shielded by the noise of the store. Adrian regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable but not distant. "No," he replied simply. "I did not." The answer lingered between them, not dismissive, not arrogant, but honest in a way that made it difficult to argue with. Naomi searched his face briefly, as if trying to understand something that did not fit into the patterns she knew, then lowered her gaze again, not out of submission, but out of thought. The world she understood had rules. This did not follow them. And that was what made it dangerous in a way she had not prepared for. "I cannot pay you back," she said after a moment, the truth spoken without hesitation, without apology. Adrian's eyes did not leave her. "I did not ask you to," he said. And in that moment, standing between the store she had just left and the life she had to return to, Naomi realized that whatever this was, it was not finished yet. Naomi stood there longer than she intended, the weight of the bags cutting slightly into her fingers, grounding her in a reality that felt increasingly unfamiliar the longer she remained in his presence. Cars passed slowly in the parking lot, tires rolling over faded asphalt, the distant hum of engines blending with the quiet rustle of a warm afternoon breeze. Everything around them continued as it should, ordinary and predictable, yet the space between them held something different, something unresolved. Adrian did not step closer, did not reach for the bags, or offer assistance again. He simply observed, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if every choice he made was measured down to the smallest detail. That restraint unsettled her more than pressure would have. People who wanted something usually made it clear. They asked, they insisted, they took. He did none of that. And that absence of demand made it harder to understand where she stood. "You should go home," he said after a moment, his voice calm, not dismissive, but certain in a way that suggested he had already considered the alternatives. Naomi shifted slightly, adjusting her grip on the bags, her shoulders tightening as if bracing against something unseen. "I have somewhere to be," she replied, her tone polite but firm, the instinct to maintain distance returning, rebuilding the barrier that had briefly fallen. Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. "I am sure you do," he said, his gaze moving briefly to the papers pressed against her side, then back to her face. "But you are not steady." It was not criticism. It was fact. Naomi exhaled slowly, her breath uneven despite her effort to control it. "I will manage," she said, the words familiar, practiced, the same answer she had given to countless situations where help came with expectations she could not afford. Adrian watched her for a moment longer, then reached into his coat again, not for his wallet this time, but for his phone. He did not ask for permission. He did not explain. He simply tapped the screen once, then lowered it back to his side. A few seconds later, a car that had been parked farther down the road eased forward, silent and precise, coming to a stop a few feet away from them. Naomi's eyes flicked toward it, then back to him, confusion tightening her expression. "I am not getting into your car," she said immediately, the boundary clear, her voice stronger now, anchored by something deeper than fatigue. Adrian did not react with surprise or offense. That was a reasonable response. He respected that. "Then you will take a cab," he said, his tone unchanged, as if presenting an alternative rather than issuing a command. "It is already on the way." Naomi stared at him, the words not fitting into the pattern she expected. "You called a cab," she repeated, disbelief slipping through despite her effort to remain composed. Adrian nodded once, simple and unembellished. "It will be here in 2 minutes." He did not add anything else. He did not say why. He did not frame it as generosity or obligation. He simply stated it as a fact, as something that had already been set into motion. Naomi's grip on the bags tightened again, the edges pressing into her skin as she processed what he had done. "You do not even know where I am going," she said quietly, the question not confrontational, but searching. Adrian's gaze held her steadily. "You will tell the driver?" he replied. The simplicity of the answer left no room for argument, no hidden expectation behind it. It was not control. It was facilitation. The distinction mattered, even if she did not want it to. A faint sound of an approaching vehicle grew closer, the soft hum of an engine turning into the parking lot entrance, slowing as it scanned the rows. Naomi glanced toward it instinctively, then back at Adrian, something shifting in her expression again, something less guarded, though not yet open. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question finally breaking through the careful structure she had maintained. Adrian considered her for a brief moment, not avoiding the question, but not rushing to answer it either. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of any trace of detachment. "Because you did not ask," he said. The words settled between them, simple but precise, carrying a weight that was not easily dismissed. The car pulled up to the curb then, stopping just within reach, the driver glancing toward them expectantly. Naomi looked at it, then back at Adrian, her thoughts moving faster than her body could follow. Nothing about this made sense in the world she knew. And yet, as she stood there with everything she had been carrying pressed tightly against her, she realized that walking away without understanding it might cost her more than accepting it ever could. Naomi did not step toward the car immediately, and that hesitation spoke louder than any refusal could have. Her body caught between instinct and something unfamiliar that had begun to take shape beneath the surface of her thoughts. The driver waited patiently, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes shifting only briefly toward Adrian before returning to a neutral gaze, as if this arrangement was not unusual to him, as if moments like this happened more often than Naomi could imagine. She adjusted the bags again, the weight pressing into her palms, reminding her of the reality she could not afford to ignore. Time was moving. The child was waiting. The bills were not going to pause simply because something unexpected had entered her life. "You do not have to stay," she said quietly, her voice carrying a different tone now, less guarded, but still careful, as if choosing each word required effort. Adrian did not answer right away. He stood where he was, the faint outline of the city reflected in the dark surface of the car behind him, his presence steady, unhurried, as though he had already decided exactly how long this moment deserved. "I am not staying," he said finally, his voice calm, not dismissive, but definitive. The distinction mattered. He was not waiting for her to accept anything. He was simply ensuring that what had already been set in motion reached its conclusion. Naomi studied him for a second longer, searching for something she could name, something that would allow her to place him within the world she understood. But there was nothing obvious to hold on to. No expectation, no demand, just a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than anything else. She glanced at the car again, then back at him, her fingers tightening slightly around the handles of the bags. "If I take this," she said slowly, the words measured, deliberate, "then it does not mean anything more." The statement was not a question. It was a boundary. Adrian inclined his head once, acknowledging it without resistance. "It means you get where you need to go," he replied, his tone unchanged, as if that was the only meaning that existed. The simplicity of it left no room for negotiation. Naomi exhaled softly, a breath she did not realize she had been holding, and for the first time since she had stepped out of the store, her shoulders lowered slightly, the tension easing just enough to allow movement. She stepped toward the car, each step careful but steady, her body still recovering, but her resolve clearer now. The driver stepped out briefly, opening the rear door without a word, his movements respectful, precise. Naomi paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, the interior of the car cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the heat and noise she had just left behind. For a moment, she looked back. Adrian had not moved. He stood exactly where she had left him, his gaze meeting hers without pressure, without expectation, but not indifferent either. There was something there, something steady, something that did not shift with circumstance the way most things in her life did. "Thank you," she said, the words softer than before, but clearer, no longer automatic, no longer just polite. This time, they carried weight. Adrian did not respond with words. He did not need to. The slight inclination of his head was enough, an acknowledgement that did not diminish the moment by over-explaining it. Naomi held his gaze for 1 second longer, then turned and stepped into the car, pulling the door closed behind her with a quiet, final sound that separated her from the moment outside. The driver returned to his seat, the engine humming softly as the car began to move, pulling away from the curb with smooth precision. Naomi sat still, the bags resting beside her, the papers pressed securely against her side once more. Through the tinted glass, she watched the figure outside grow smaller, the distance increasing with each passing second. He did not follow. He did not signal. He simply remained where he was until the car turned and he was no longer in view. Naomi leaned back slightly, her body finally allowing itself to register the exhaustion she had been holding at bay. Her eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in thought, in the quiet processing of something she had not expected and did not yet understand. Outside, the city continued as it always did, indifferent and constant. But inside that moving car, Naomi Carter knew that something had shifted, not in her circumstances yet, not in the reality she had to return to, but in the way the world had just responded to her. And for the first time in a long time, she was not entirely sure what that meant. The car moved smoothly through the city, the steady rhythm of the engine blending with the quiet hum of traffic outside. And for the first few minutes Naomi said nothing, her hands resting loosely on the bags beside her, her fingers still faintly marked by the pressure of holding on too tightly for too long. The driver did not speak either, his presence professional and unobtrusive, as if silence itself was part of the service. Naomi kept her gaze on the passing streets, familiar buildings sliding by in softened reflections through the tinted window, yet everything felt slightly different, as if the same world she had navigated every day had shifted just enough to feel unfamiliar. After a moment, she reached into the bag at her side, pulling out the folded papers again, her movements careful, almost reverent, as though each page carried more than just printed ink. She opened them slowly, her eyes scanning the lines she already knew by heart, the dates, the charges, the notes that had accumulated over months of hospital visits and unanswered questions. The name at the top remained the same, steady and unchanging, a reminder of why. She had been pushing herself beyond her limits. Her thumb traced the edge of the paper lightly, grounding herself in the purpose that had not changed, no matter what had happened earlier. The car turned onto a narrower street, the buildings closer together now, less polished, more worn, the kind of neighborhood where people noticed everything but asked very little. Naomi straightened slightly, her focus sharpening as the destination drew closer, the brief moment of stillness in the car, giving way to the reality waiting ahead. "You can stop at the next corner," she said quietly, her voice steady again, returning to the tone she used when control was necessary. The driver nodded once, adjusting the route without question, slowing the car as instructed. As they approached the corner, Naomi gathered her things, folding the papers carefully and tucking them back into the bag, ensuring nothing was out of place, nothing exposed. The car came to a smooth stop, the engine idling softly as the driver stepped out to open the door for her once more. Naomi paused before exiting, her hand resting briefly against the seat, as if acknowledging the space she was about to leave behind. Then she stepped out, the air outside warmer, heavier, carrying the faint sounds of distant conversation and the subtle clatter of everyday life continuing without interruption. The car door closed behind her with a quiet click, and for a moment, she stood there, the weight of the bags pulling gently at her arms, the reality of where she was settling back into place. Ahead of her, a modest apartment building stood with its worn brick exterior and narrow windows, the entrance doors slightly scuffed from years of use. She adjusted her grip and began to walk, each step measured but more certain now, her body finding its rhythm again despite the lingering fatigue. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something warm, like food that had been cooked hours earlier and still lingered in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as she passed beneath them, casting soft shadows that moved with her. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing lightly against the railing for support, her breath steady but careful, conserving what little energy she had left. When she reached the second floor, she paused for a moment outside a worn wooden door, her gaze settling on the small number plate beside it. This was where everything that mattered waited. She shifted the bags once more, then lifted her hand and knocked gently, the sound soft but deliberate. For a second, there was no response, just the quiet hum of the building around her. Then footsteps approached from inside, light but quick, followed by the faint click of a lock turning. The door opened just enough to reveal a small face peeking through, eyes bright despite the tiredness behind them. Naomi's expression softened instantly, the tension she had carried all day easing in a way nothing else had managed to do. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice warm now, entirely different from before, and as the door opened wider, she stepped inside, leaving the outside world behind, but carrying with her something that had not been there before, something quiet and unresolved that had only just begun to take shape. The apartment door closed softly behind Naomi, and for a moment, the outside world disappeared completely, replaced by the quiet, fragile rhythm of a space held together by effort rather than ease. The small boy stepped back to let her in, his eyes immediately drawn to the bags in her hands, curiosity flickering across his face despite the faint tiredness that lingered beneath it. Naomi set the groceries down carefully on the narrow kitchen counter, her movements slower now, not from hesitation, but from the exhaustion she could finally no longer ignore. "You should be resting," she said gently, turning toward him, her voice softening in a way that felt almost instinctive. The boy shrugged slightly, a small gesture that carried more weight than it should have. "I was waiting," he replied, his voice quiet but steady, as if waiting had become something he was used to. Naomi paused at that, her expression shifting, something deeper moving behind her eyes as she reached out and brushed a hand lightly over his hair. "You do not have to wait for me," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they were not entirely true. Some things could not be replaced, no matter how much she wanted them to be easier. She turned back to the counter, unpacking the items one by one, placing them in their proper places with the same care she had shown earlier, the routine grounding her, restoring a sense of order to a day that had slipped too far out of her control. The carton of milk went into the refrigerator, the bread onto the small shelf, the soup lined neatly beside the others that had been stretched across too many meals. Each item had a purpose. Each one mattered. The boy watched quietly, his gaze following her movements, his presence steady but observant in a way that felt older than his years. "Did you get it?" he asked after a moment, his voice carrying a cautious hope that made Naomi's hands pause briefly before continuing. She knew what he meant. She reached into the bag and pulled out the papers, unfolding them slowly, her eyes scanning the same lines once more before nodding. "I did," she said softly, though the words carried both truth and uncertainty. It was not enough yet. It was never enough yet. But it was something. And sometimes, something was all she could offer. The boy nodded, accepting the answer without question, as if he had learned not to expect more than what was given. Naomi folded the papers again, but this time she did not tuck them away immediately. Instead, she set them on the table, her fingers resting lightly against them as her thoughts drifted back to the moment outside the store, to the man who had stepped in without being asked, who had seen more than she had intended to reveal. She had spent so long ensuring that no one looked closely, that no one had reason to. And yet, he had. Without pressure. Without expectation. without asking for anything in return. The boy climbed onto the small chair at the table, his eyes now fixed on her, sensing the shift in her focus even if he did not fully understand it. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question simple but direct. Naomi looked at him, really looked this time, and something in her expression softened completely, the tension that had carried through the entire day easing in a way that only this space, this presence, could bring. "I am," she said, and this time the words felt closer to true than they had before. She reached out and took his hand briefly, a small gesture, but one that grounded both of them in the moment. Outside, the city moved forward without pause, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place within those walls. And somewhere not far away, a man who had built his life on control and distance stood still for a fraction longer than usual, replaying a moment that did not fit into the world he knew. He had seen something in her that refused to be ignored. And in a life where everything had a cost, where every action carried consequence, that moment stood apart. Because she had asked for nothing. And yet, she had changed something anyway. The room fell into a quiet stillness as Naomi returned to her routine, but the weight of what had begun that day did not fade. It settled, quietly, beneath the surface of everything that followed. And though nothing had been promised, nothing had been defined, the world had shifted in a way that neither of them could fully undo. And in that quiet, unspoken space between what was and what could be, something had already taken root, something that would not remain invisible for long.